Welcome back to Chapter 17 of Price Analysis, a fundamental approach to the study of commodity markets. We're going to continue here with section 17.1.1, and we're going to talk about the West Texas Intermediate, or WTI, versus the Brent crude oil. So we talked about in the previous video light sweet crude oil versus heavy sweet or heavy sour crude oil. And it turns out that because light sweet crude oil is the most valuable classification of crude oil, you're usually, when you hear people talking about the price of crude oil, they're usually talking about light sweet crude oil in two particular kinds. One being West Texas Intermediate and the other being Brent crude oil. We'll talk about what each of those terms means now. So WTI crude oil is the West Texas Intermediate crude oil price, and it happens to be the benchmark price for light sweet crude oil produced in North America. It's the benchmark because the NYMEX has a futures contract that's specified for light sweet crude oil, and that contract is delivered at Cushing, Oklahoma. If you take a look at where crude oil is produced in the United States, the number 1 state is Texas, number 2 is North Dakota, 3 California, 4 Alaska, and number 5 Oklahoma. Alright, so now let's discuss what Brent crude oil is. And Brent crude oil is the benchmark price of light sweet crude oil that's extracted from the North Sea. And where is the North Sea? It is this sea here between the United Kingdom and mainland Europe. And there's quite a bit of oil that's extracted from this region. And it is referred to as Brent crude oil. So it turns out that the oil that typically comes out of those regions is a little bit more sour than WTI crude oil. Remember, that means it has a little bit more sulfur content. And usually, or most often historically, that little bit more sourness has meant that it often trades at a bit of a discount to West Texas Intermediate crude oil. But that spread between Brent crude oil and WTI can be affected by local supply and demand factors and other things. So we'll talk about that a little bit later too when we start looking at prices. But before we do that, let's talk about crude oil production globally. So this next figure lists the top 5 crude oil producing countries from 1980 to 2013. And you can see here some of the major players. Not that long ago, the former USSR was the highest producer in the world, and more recently, Russia has kind of picked up that tradition and become more and more of an important player in the crude oil market. Saudi Arabia is famously a major player in the crude oil market, and the United States has been increasingly an important player in the world crude oil market, and China and Canada are kind of slow and steadily increasing over time in their production of crude oil. Alright, let's talk about some basics of refining crude oil. So when you go to refine a barrel of crude oil, the exact proportions of the refined products that you'll get, whether that's gasoline, the proportion that you'll get of gasoline versus diesel versus jet fuel, that can be varied a little bit by changing the specifics of the refining product. So if gasoline is more highly valued relative to diesel fuel, you can tweak the process so that the crude oil barrel will produce a little bit more gasoline than diesel, and vice versa if diesel fuel is relatively more valuable. But it is important to note that the higher valued products that are the more highly refined products tend to be more costly to produce. So there's always going to be this trade-off that refiners have to make about what exactly processes they're going to use to get specific quantities of the various products out of one barrel of crude oil. While they can impact the relative proportions slightly, those relative proportions are kind of determined broadly by the characteristics of the crude oil. Like we said before, light sweet crude oil can be more easily made into more highly refined products, So if you start out with a very heavy crude oil, it's going to be very difficult to produce a high proportion of gasoline from that barrel, for example. But we can look at some averages and get a sense of what the proportions look like. So in 2014, the average proportions of refined products, this is coming from the EIA, the U.S. Energy Information Administration. 1 barrel of crude oil, which is 42 gallons. 1 barrel of crude oil produced 19 gallons of gasoline, 12 gallons of diesel, 4 gallons of jet fuel, 7 gallons of other product, and then some other more minor products. So this is a pretty good place to cut the video. We'll pick up in the next video talking about recent price trends in these energy markets.